It's December 20th of 1928, and after 2 long weeks of relentless search efforts, a rescue plane flying over the Grand Canyon National Park in Arizona finally spotted something promising. Down below, floating on the Colorado River, was a small wooden boat, which could be the break the rescue team needed to locate the missing couple they'd been desperately searching for. Exactly 32 days earlier, they were last seen about 220 kilometers upstream, but they never showed up at their intended destination, triggering a search operation. The couple, 30-year-old Glenn Roland Hyde and 23-year-old Bessie Louise Haley, had been attempting to set a speed record on their honeymoon, navigating the rugged Colorado River. But somewhere along their ambitious journey, things had gone terribly wrong, and they disappeared without a trace. So when the research plane finally spotted their boat, rescuers rushed down to the rocky riverbank, hoping to find the couple or at least some clue on what had happened. However, what they found only raised even more questions. Instead of a wreck or anything that looked out of place, the boat was in perfect condition, upright and fully stocked, even with Bessie's diary still inside. The only thing missing was the couple, as if they had vanished from the face of the earth all out of nowhere. Glenn and Bessie's story kicked off in 1927 when they crossed paths on a passenger ship bound for Los Angeles. Glenn, a farmer from Idaho, had just wrapped up an epic adventure where he boated all the way from the Salmon River to the Pacific Ocean in a scow he had built with his own hands. Bessie, on the other hand, was a free-spirited artist with a passion for theater and poetry from her student days. The moment she met Glenn, they instantly felt a connection, and the two quickly started spending a lot of time together. There was just one complication. Bessie was already married, but things took a turn the following year when her marriage ended. Wasting no time, the couple tied the knot the very next day. To kick off their life together in a true adventurous style, they planned a honeymoon that was as unconventional as their romance. Back then, extreme sport athletes like mountaineers and skiers were gaining celebrity status. Glenn and Bessie had an idea. If they could conquer the wild Colorado River as it raged through the Grand Canyon National Park in a homemade scow, it would be a game changer for them. At that point, only 45 people had ever completed that full journey, and the stakes were high. Not only would it make them famous, but Bessie would also become the first woman to achieve the feat, setting a brand new record. Glenn had plenty of rowing experience under his belt, but Bessie was a newbie when it came to this kind of adventure. Still, the promise of glory and the thrill of sharing such a once-in-a-lifetime experience with Glenn were too tempting to pass up. She was all in, ready to embrace the risk for a shot at making history. In early October 1928, they made their way to Green River, Utah, where Glenn crafted a 20-foot wooden sweep scow exactly like the type used by river runners back in Idaho. On October 20th, they set off down the Green and Colorado rivers, aiming to reach Needles in California by the first week of December. The beginning of their journey was smooth sailing. They had packed plenty of provisions, and Glenn's skills in river riding and boat building kept them afloat through Colorado's wild waters. To make sure their adventure got the attention they felt it deserved, they met up with a few people along the way. One of them was a well-known photographer, Emery Kolb, who had a studio on the southern rim of the Grand Canyon. Kolb was also an experienced river rider who knew the Colorado River's volatile nature, and he quickly noticed that Glenn and Bessie weren't carrying life jackets. When he pointed it out, Glenn laughed it off, saying they were already halfway through and hadn't had any issues so far. Back then, life jackets weren't a must-have for river riding, and it was up to the individual to decide what safety measures to take. However, it wasn't just the life jackets. Glenn seemed to be rushing through the journey, focused on making it to their destination as soon as possible. Bessie, on the other hand, wasn't quite as sure. She looked hesitant to get back into the boat, perhaps from the exhaustion of the journey so far, or maybe it was the fear of the dangerous rapids ahead. Kolb could see that Glenn was pushing her to continue, even though she didn't seem fully on board. Before they boarded the boat again, Bessie caught sight of the outfit Kolb's young daughter was wearing and commented, "I wonder if I shall ever wear pretty shoes again." That simple remark made Kolb realize that Bessie had already sensed they weren't fully prepared for what lay ahead, though by then, their fate had already been sealed. Kolb bid them farewell, but his photography friend stayed with the couple for a few more kilometers. They parted ways at one of the Colorado River's more challenging spots due to its Class 5 rapids, known as Hermit Rapid. On November 18th of 1928, those fierce waves at Hermit Rapid became the last place Glenn and Bessie were seen alive. The first week of December came and went, but Glenn and Bessie never made it to their destination. Their families grew concerned, sensing something was wrong. After a couple of days, a full-scale rescue operation was launched to find them as quickly as possible. 2 weeks later, their boat was discovered, but there was no sign of an accident or any clue about what had happened to them. Bessie's diary, found on the boat, had entries up until November 30th, showing they'd been on the water for another 12 days after they were last seen. According to Bessie's notes, they had actually been ahead of schedule, making it as far as Diamond Creek, which was several kilometers ahead of where their boat was eventually found. The search for them continued for years, but it led nowhere. Glenn and Bessie were presumed dead. That is until 1971, when the story made headlines again due to a woman named Elizabeth Cutler. During a river tour of the Grand Canyon, she sat around the campfire and shocked everyone by announcing that she was Bessie Hyde. She claimed that during her trip, she had stabbed and killed Glenn after a heated argument and had been living a secret life ever since. What's more shocking was that her age seemed to match what Bessie's would have been if she'd survived. This bold statement didn't go unnoticed. A reporter tracked Elizabeth down for an interview to get more details, but when faced with the pressure, Elizabeth backed off, claiming she had never even heard of Bessie Hyde. It's likely that her statement was a prank to get some attention. Glenn and Bessie had become local legends, with tourists exchanging their story every time they visited the Grand Canyon. She probably overheard it during her trip and decided to jump in and make a name for herself. Although it turned out to be a fabrication, the rumor that Bessie survived the canyon wouldn't die. In 1972, legendary Grand Canyon river guide Georgie Clark passed away, and when people went through her belongings, some strange details came to light. For one, Georgie's birth certificate revealed that her name wasn't Georgie, it was Bessie DeRoss. Among her provisions was the marriage certificate of Glenn and Bessie, along with a pistol. This got people talking that Bessie might have been living under an assumed identity. However, Georgie was a famous figure, and her early life had been well documented. Her childhood photos didn't resemble Bessie at all, so experts concluded that their same birth names were just coincidental. The marriage certificate likely made its way into Georgie's possession because of her long career as a guide in the park, where she had probably come across some of Glenn and Bessie's documents. All these odd bits and pieces probably just fed into the wild speculation that had been swirling for years. In 1972, another strange twist came into the play with the death of the photographer Emery Kolb. Almost a year after he passed, a skeleton was found in the garage of his abandoned studio. It belonged to a man in his 20s who seemed to match Glenn's height and build. But unlike Glenn, the man's cause of death was clear. He had a bullet hole in his skull. For nearly 30 years, Kolb was suspected of killing Glenn, until 2008 when it was revealed that the man in Kolb's garage was actually an unidentified person who had taken his own life back in 1933. Still, the question of how his remains ended up in Kolb's garage remained unsettling, but it was clear that Kolb hadn't murdered him, and it definitely wasn't Glenn. With all the theories and wild speculations flying around, the most plausible explanation for what happened to Glenn and Bessie remains that they were simply trying to conquer one of the most dangerous sections of the Colorado River without life jackets. A small slip, loss of balance, and one might have fallen in, with the other jumping in to save them. The violent currents could have swept them both away in an instant. That theory mostly fits, but there's still one lingering question. How did their boat end up kilometers beyond where they were supposed to be, according to Bessie's diary? Either her notes were inaccurate, or the river's currents carried the boat for days, taking it far beyond their last known location. Both conditions seem a bit far-fetched, but they remain possibilities. It's been almost a century since Glenn and Bessie disappeared in the Grand Canyon, and their story continues to be one of the park's greatest and most controversial mysteries. Nestled in the heart of Colorado, Rocky Mountain National Park offers a landscape that feels like a world of its own. Stretching across 1,076 square kilometers, the park features everything from sprawling meadows in the montane zone to shimmering alpine lakes and rugged peaks that rise over 14,000 feet. This diverse terrain invites hikers to explore a stunning variety of mountain environments, with over 500 kilometers of trails catering to all skill levels. Along the way, the wildlife adds an extra layer of wonder, whether it's elk grazing in the meadows or marmots scurrying across rocky outcrops. Fishing has also been one of the all-time favorite activities for tourists since the park's first season in 1915. With more than 50 crystal-clear lakes and a network of countless streams, anglers find plenty of serene spots to cast their lines and often hope for a catch like trout or other native fish species. In 2022, the park recorded its peak annual visitors at 4.3 million, which back in 1938 was still a record-breaking number, with 659,000 people immersing themselves in its trails, scenic beauty, and the thrill of its outdoor adventures. That's exactly how the Beilharz family must have envisioned their holiday on the Independence Day weekend in 1938. On July 3rd, William Harvey Beilharz, along with his 10 children and a few close friends and their families, headed out to camp in the Rocky Mountain National Park. The group got an early start, setting up camp that morning, and planned to go fishing at a nearby stream after grabbing some refreshments. In the meantime, William decided to take a stroll down to the river to wash up and check the conditions. As he stepped out of his tent, his 4-year-old son Alfred decided to tag along with him. At the time, 2 of William's friends had also gone off to freshen up, but they were a bit farther upstream from them. Once he finished washing up, William figured it was time to head back to camp. Alfred, though, knowing his dad's friends weren't too far off, decided to wander over and catch up with them. William walked back to camp, watching Alfred strolling upstream towards his friends. But that little boy never made it to them. The 2 friends upstream didn't spot Alfred coming their way either, and after finishing up, they made their way back to camp as well. That's when it hit everyone: Alfred wasn't with them. The family immediately started the search for Alfred. There were a dozen people at the campsite, so they figured it would be a quick find. After all, a 4-year-old couldn't have gotten far in such a short time, but their assumptions quickly proved to be way off. The group yelled and shouted Alfred's name, scouring every corner of the campsite and the surrounding area where he was last seen. But Alfred didn't appear. As the minutes turned into hours, the tension began to rise, and they decided to call in the park service for help. The park rangers immediately recognized the urgency of the situation and understood that the search needed to be expanded quickly, so they called in the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, who were working as part of a government work relief program. Within 45 minutes, over 100 CCC members arrived at the campsite to start their search. The Beilharz family, along with their volunteers and park rangers, teamed up with the CCC, combing the area throughout the entire day. But there was still no sign of Alfred. The next morning on Independence Day, they brought in bloodhounds from Colorado State Prison to assist. Unfortunately, the dogs couldn't pick up Alfred's scent. The following day on July 5th, the search teams, assuming Alfred might have fallen into the river, decided to put up some makeshift dams to stop the flow. They knew that if he had been swept away, he would have already died by then. The teams gathered logs, rocks, sandbags, and anything they could find to block the water, and began searching the riverbed with pikes and grappling hooks, but their efforts proved fruitless. Realizing that the currents may have carried him away before the dams were even set up, they installed a wire net near the river's fall, hoping that even if his body had been swept past the dams, the net would catch it. As more volunteers and local rescue workers joined the search, the teams combed every inch of the riverbed, but there was still no sign of Alfred. It became clear that he hadn't fallen into the river, and now the focus shifted to him possibly getting lost in the forest or being kidnapped. The new direction gave them a sliver of hope that Alfred might still be alive and could eventually be found. While all of this was happening on July 3rd, the same day Alfred disappeared, a radio technician from Denver and his wife were hiking in the Rocky Mountain National Park, about 10 kilometers from where the Beilharz family had camped. Around 1 p.m., just hours after the incident, they had stopped to take a break near the base of the 12,000-foot elevation called Mount Chapin. As they rested, they looked up and were stunned to spot a young boy sitting on a rock, hunched over in an area known as the Devil's Nest on the mountainside. The place was so strangely quiet that they could literally hear the boy making a strange shrill noise as he stared at them. He remained there for several minutes, but when the couple moved to get a closer look, they saw him either fall behind the ledge or get yanked back from the other side. Concerned about the child, the duo decided to hike to the spot, but when they reached the ledge he was sitting on, there was no sign of him. The couple freaked out and rushed back to the car. That's when they heard about a missing child on the radio. When they got home, they checked the newspaper and saw a photo of Alfred Beilharz, and realized it was the same child they had seen in the Devil's Nest. Without wasting any time, they drove back to the park and alerted the rangers. Despite the seemingly impossibility of Alfred having made it to the top of Devil's Nest on his own, and within just a few hours, the rangers sent out a team of 150 men to search the mountain, but they too came back empty-handed with no clues to follow. By then, Alfred's parents were convinced that their son had been abducted. In response to their growing concern, the FBI revealed that a dirty bandage had been found in an abandoned cabin in the park, some distance from where Alfred had already gone missing. Alfred's mother recognized the bandage material. It matched the one she had used to treat a blister on his foot before their camping trip. On the same day, a woman living near the park saw a boy walking along the highway with a mysterious man as she and her husband drove past them. At the time, she had no idea about Alfred's disappearance, but when she saw his photo in the newspaper the next day, she immediately recognized him. Though her sighting didn't lead to any breakthroughs, It further reinforced the belief that Alfred had been abducted. If that was the case, continuing the search in the park seemed pointless. Still, to rule out any missing clues, the rangers brought in sniffer dogs once again. This time, the dogs caught Alfred's scent, but lost it in the exact area where his father had last seen him. Another set of dogs were brought in, and they too detected the scent, but their trail led them to a different spot, roughly 500 feet higher on the elevation. There, the scent suddenly stopped, and the dogs lay down, refusing to continue. The teams tried to engage the dogs forward, but they couldn't get past that point. With no progress being made, the rescue operation was called off after 10 days of exhaustive searching. On November 27th, nearly 5 months after Alfred went missing, his father received a ransom note demanding $500, which would be about $11,000 in today's money. The alleged kidnappers instructed him to leave the money in a can 1 block from their house, promising they would return Alfred within 24 hours. However, just 2 days later, police confirmed that it was a hoax, as the case had received widespread attention from newspapers. To this day, the true fate of Alfred remains a mystery, but there are some strange inconsistencies surrounding the case. One of the most talked about theories involves supernatural elements. People point to sightings of a child near Devil's Nest and the odd behavior of sniffer dogs, leading many to believe that there was something far creepier at play than just a missing boy. Others suggest that Alfred might have been abducted or even murdered, with his body buried at the spot where the sniffer dogs lost his scent 500 feet away. However, search parties never considered this possibility. And then there's the unsettling fact that Alfred disappeared right under the noses of so many people. His father seemed unconcerned about him walking alone beside the river. This has fueled speculation that Alfred may have been accidentally killed by his own family, and the entire search and rescue operation was just a cover-up. The most likely explanation, though, is the one that search parties initially believed. Alfred fell into the river and drowned. But for reasons still unclear, his body could never be found. Fall of the year 1982, a routine passenger bus is traveling through the city of Merced, California, heading northeast towards the rugged terrain of Yosemite National Park, with a mixed crowd of passengers aboard. Among them is a young woman named Patricia Hicks, originally from Washington, sitting quietly with her eyes fixed out the window, seemingly lost and deep in thought as the bus winds through the fading autumn colors. The 27-year-old is running from the haunting events of her past, but what she doesn't know is that what lies ahead is a path even more disturbing and unexpected. This 130-kilometer journey ends up being the last time anyone would see Patricia alive. Born on June 1st of 1954 in Washington, Patricia Marie Hicks, known to her family as Patty, came from a working-class family. Her father worked as a cabinet maker, and her mother was a manager at a local supermarket chain. Money was tight, which meant resources were always uncertain, leaving her childhood marked by a constant struggle that left its impact as she grew older. When she was in junior high, her 23-year-old brother, who had been struggling with mental illness, took his own life while serving on a Coast Guard vessel. Patricia was very close to him, and his death left her deeply shaken. Still, somehow, she kept on pushing through high school and eventually managed to graduate. During her college years, her interests grew closer with a classmate, sparking a connection that added a new chapter to her life. The duo soon got married, but things didn't seem to improve for Patricia. The trauma from her past and ongoing emotional struggles made her feel disconnected, and it didn't take long before they both parted ways in 1974. Already emotionally burdened, Patricia now became even more vulnerable. She spent a couple of years trying to heal, but when nothing seemed to bring her peace, she decided to move away from Washington to Merced in California, hoping to start a new life. After settling in her new hometown, Patricia discovered a local church called San Anda, founded by a man named Donald Eugene Gibson. Known for his mysterious and magnetic personality, Donald worked as a bookkeeper and yoga teacher, growing popular in the community. On the surface, he seemed like the kind of spiritual figure Patricia could turn to for guidance, but some locals had a darker view of him. There was a belief that he was a cult leader, hiding behind the facade of a bookkeeper and yoga teacher, using his position to exploit innocent people. He would allegedly recruit them based on their looks rather than religious beliefs, eventually manipulating and abusing them for all sorts of wrong things. While Patricia wouldn't have believed it, it surprisingly turned out to be true. Donald had been involved in this dark world since the 1970s, taking advantage of hundreds of people, including several minors. Patricia didn't realize this until 1981, when Donald and several members of his group, including her, were arrested. But because she was unaware of the extent of his crimes, she was let go after agreeing to testify against him. Donald was convicted of 4 counts of sexually exploiting minors, and it came out that he had been drugging his victims with LSD before assaulting them. Despite these terrifying revelations and numerous testimonies against him, Donald was still allowed to stay out on a bond while awaiting his sentencing. Seizing the opportunity, he fled to Mexico and was never seen again. For Patricia, though, the whole experience left her completely crushed. She shut herself off from her family, and unable to deal with the aftermath, she made the decision to leave the city again, this time setting her sights on Yosemite National Park. In September 1982, 28-year-old Patricia boarded a bus from Merced to Yosemite after telling her roommate about her plan, leaving her old life behind once and for all. But what she couldn't have known was that the road ahead would lead her down an even darker and more disturbing path. After she set off, Patricia was never seen alive again. Though it was a prime camping destination, Yosemite didn't have any permanent living spots, so why would she have chosen it? And more importantly, what really happened to her? The truth of her journey remained an unsettling mystery. Merced, where Patricia lived, is known as the gateway to Yosemite National Park. In 1926, Highway 140 was built between the two locations, making it easier for visitors to reach Yosemite's stunning landscapes by public transport. For all its surreal views and majestic landscapes, Yosemite National Park attracts around 3.8 million visitors every year, and back in the 1980s this number was no smaller. Besides one of the world's biggest waterfalls and granite peaks, this park also offers nearly 1,300 kilometers of hiking trails, making it a paradise for recreation and outdoor activities. So it was quite possible that Patricia was planning to camp there for a while, take a break, and figure out her next move. Or maybe she just wandered in, with no particular plan at all. Her friends and relatives were left searching for answers that never came. Almost a year later, a family outing in the summit meadows of Yosemite National Park took a horrifying turn. While some kids were running around, they stumbled upon a torn-off human hand and forearm lying in the open. The group quickly alerted the authorities, who collected the remains. The hand and arm were severely decomposed, and animals had scavenged them. Experts estimated they had been there for at least a year, possibly frozen and decayed over the course of an entire winter season. Despite an extensive search of the surrounding area, nothing else related to the arm was found until 5 years later. That's when another discovery, this time a human skull, was reported just across the road from where the hand had been found. Upon examination, it was believed the skull belonged to a young woman, likely in her late teens or 20s, of either European or Hispanic descent. However, due to the limitations of DNA testing at the time, no conclusive identification could be made. Still, it was presumed that the severed hand and skull belonged to the same individual, most likely a female. For the next 2 decades, the remains were known as Summit Meadows Jane Doe in the case files of the county office. In the United States, an unidentified missing female is given the placeholder name of Jane Doe, while a male is called John Doe. It wasn't until 2009 that DNA analysis confirmed both sets of remains belonged to the same person. However, investigators were still left with no idea who she was, and no one came forward to claim her. Despite efforts by forensic anthropologists to reconstruct her face from genetic markers and skull shape, they repeatedly hit dead ends. Then in 2021, nearly 40 years later after she vanished, forensic genealogists finally identified Summit Meadows Jane Doe as Patricia Marie Hicks. As investigators searched for answers, they came across an unusual lead. Some of the officers suspected that Patricia might have been a victim of Henry Lee Lucas, who was one of the most infamous serial killers of the 20th century. Lucas, who died in 2001 while serving a life sentence, had claimed responsibility for around 600 murders in the 1980s. Among his confessions was a detailed account of killing a young blonde hitchhiker he said he had picked up near Yosemite National Park. Lucas even led officers to a campsite he described as the crime scene in the park. There, the cops found chicken bones and beer cans, but without a body, the case couldn't move forward. For a moment, it seemed like Patricia's killer had been identified, even if he had died years earlier, but when they looked into his prison profile during the sentence, things became confusing once again. While behind bars, Lucas frequently made several false confessions, claiming responsibility for murders he hadn't committed. He discovered that every time he confessed to a crime, it earned him both fame and attention, not just from fellow inmates, but also from investigators. To keep him cooperating, authorities would offer him perks like cigarettes, better food, and even trips outside the prison to supposedly revisit crime scenes. This so-called star treatment gave him an escape from the dull routine of prison life, and in a way, became his new form of entertainment. The police on the other end were also reckless with Lucas, using his false confessions as a tool for solving difficult cases. They'd feed him information, hoping he would weave into the details to make his claims appear more credible. Of the 600 confessions he made, only 3 were linked to actual murders. In Patricia's case, though, the discovery of chicken bones and beer cans at a campsite where she was killed made many people believe that Lucas could have been the killer. However, investigators don't consider this as a solid evidence of murder. At best, it suggests that Lucas might have been in Yosemite National Park around the same time, possibly even crossing paths with her. But whether he actually killed her remains unproven. Some investigators point to another serial killer active in the area, or even suggest that Donald Eugene Gibson killed her in revenge for her testimony, but again, there's no conclusive proof. To this day, what truly happened to Patricia Hicks in Yosemite National Park remains a mystery.